Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about one-steps, and specifically I want to talk about how you can simulate a feature that's coming in CSM 10.1 called action blocks in versions prior to CSM 10.1. Now, it's not a perfect analog, and we'll get to some of the reasons why that's the case a little bit later in the video, but first I wanted to dive right in, start creating some one-steps. Basically, what we're going to do is create one-step that calls another one-step or runs another one-step. That's nothing crazy. There's a sub-action in one-steps called run a one-step. Super simple. It just runs a different one-step. But we're actually going to share some data between the two one-steps, or some of you who are more familiar with programming might call it passing data into the second one-step. If you're familiar with programming, this is kind of like calling a function. Not quite, but kind of. And we'll see that in action here in just a minute. So I'm going to go into the rich client and pull up the one-step manager. And I've actually already created the one-steps that we're going to use for this demo. So first, I'm going to open one that I've called demo inner one-step. This one is the one-step that gets called. So we have inner and outer. The outer one-step is the one that's going to be actually invoked from the UI, and it's going to run the inner one-step. The idea here is that inner one-step is maybe some functionality that's shared that needs to be used from multiple different places within the system and would be run from multiple outer one-steps. In this example, I just have one inner and one outer one-step, but in reality, you would probably end up reusing the inner one-step. That's why you might want to encapsulate it in its own one-step, or in CSM 10.1 in its own action block. So we'll talk about action blocks once CSM 10.1 is released. But for now, let's talk about the currently released versions of CSM. I'm running CSM 10.0, but if you're running an earlier version of CSM, what I'm showing should still work. Okay, so let's dive into this demo inner one-step. Now, you can see that this is a pretty simple one-step. It only has one action inside of it. All we're doing is showing a pop-up. The only thing that it's doing is this token right here, demo between one-steps. And what is that? It is a stored value. Demo between one-steps. Let's see what's going on with this stored value. So stored values, in case you're not familiar, is a way to basically store information in the system between one-steps, between different time periods. It's just a way of storing kind of unstructured data that's not a business object. So let's find that. Where is that? Demo between one-steps. And let's edit that stored value. So at first glance, nothing too crazy. We gave it a name. It's of type text because we're using this for a pop-up. So text value is exactly what we want. I left default value blank. Depending on how you're using it, you might want to set a default value, but in this case, I didn't want to. But this checkbox is important. Value is user specific. This means that there isn't one copy of the stored value for the entire system. Each user has his or her own copy of the stored value. So if multiple people are using this stored value at the same time, they each have their own copy and they're not going to interfere with each other. So if one person's stored value has Bob and another one's stored value has Jim, they're not going to overlap, cause any clashes. In this case, since we're showing a pop-up, Bob won't get Jim in the pop-up and Jim won't get Bob in the pop-up. There's that sort of user-level isolation. The next checkbox, remember the user-specific values between sessions. I leave unchecked just as an additional way to clean up after myself. We'll talk a little bit later on specifically how to clean up after yourself because that is an important consideration. But leaving this box unchecked is kind of an additional level of safety to make sure that Even if you forget to clean up after yourself or something goes wrong in the middle of a one step, it doesn't persist forever. It will get cleared out at the end of your current session. So we'll close out of this, and that's basically this inner one step. So now let's go see the outer one step. And this is where kind of the important stuff is. So there are two steps here, so we're getting slightly more complicated. Instead of one action, we have two actions. The second one is the obvious, let's run another one step. The one step we're going to run is demo inner one step. Nothing crazy there. Where all the magic happens is in this update variables and stored values step. The stored value, in this case, it's not a variable we're updating, it's a stored value that we're updating, is demo between one steps, that stored value that I pulled up just a minute ago. And in this case, I'm setting the value based on a prompt. So if I dive into that prompt, you'll see nothing fancy here. All I'm doing is prompting for a value of type text. Basically, the scenario that I've created is when you run demo outer one step, you get a prompt asking you to enter some text. You enter some text. This one step calls demo inner one step, which shows the text that you entered back to you. Basically the simplest possible test to prove that we can share data between two different one steps. So let's cancel, let's close out of this, and let's run demo inner one step. We get our prompt asking us to enter some text. Let's say, hi there. Click OK. And then we get a pop-up showing us, hi there. This pop-up comes from demo inner one step. The prompt that we got a minute ago came from demo outer one step. So we can see that the information was successfully shared between the two one steps. Now, before we end the video, there are a couple concepts that are worth talking about, kind of in the gotcha realm. And the first one is the idea of data ownership. So this concept might be familiar to you if you've used a language like C or C++. What I'm about to describe might sound a lot like malloc and free or new and delete. Or if you've used assembly language and done some assembly language programming, this might sound a lot like function calling semantics, how to deal with data on the stack, that sort of thing. If all of that sounded like gibberish to you, don't worry, you don't need to know it. It's just an analogy for people who have done that in their past. If you've done something more like dealt with a chain of custody or something like that, that might be a more familiar analogy. It's not quite the same, but you can kind of think of it the same way. Basically, your two one steps, inner and outer, are like actors in your chain of custody, and the information is the thing you're tracking. So in our case, we have the outer one step. It creates the information. It stores the value in the stored value, and then grants access to the inner one step. It doesn't wholesale give ownership to the inner one step, but it just allows the inner one step to see that information. So that's one way you can do it. Now, it's not uncommon, especially if you're doing this model specifically to reuse inner one step all over the place, that your cleanup actions might get a little complex. Maybe you have a bunch of stored values that you need to clean up. And if you have to put those cleanup one-step actions in all of your outer one steps, that kind of defeats the purpose of having this one common inner one step that provides the common logic that all the outer one steps use. So you can explicitly say that the inner one step, you are giving ownership over to the inner one step. And I've done that before. I've created a stored value that I called caller cleans up. So I actually kind of inverted the convention. Instead of ownership staying with whoever created the information, which is the convention, the common convention dealing with these sorts of processes. I actually kind of inverted it, and I said, even though the outer one step creates the information, it's the inner one step's responsibility to clean up, because I want all of that common cleanup one step logic in the centralized place, unless I specifically set a stored value saying that I, as the outer one step, want to keep ownership. If that kind of went fast for you, feel free to rewind, listen to it again. If you have questions on that, leave a comment below. This is kind of a tricky concept. So that's one way you could deal with this data ownership mechanism. And in this case, we created information in the outer one step and then used it in the inner one step. But what if you were going the other way? What if you were running an inner one step to, say, get information from a web API or something like that? That's fine, but in that case, your inner one step is creating the information, and then you do want to be explicit that you are handing ownership back to the outer one step. So in that case, you wouldn't want the inner one step to clean up, because if the inner one step cleans up, no one else gets to use the information. So there's that direction as well. Some other gotchas to be aware of are just making sure that someone cleans up. Because what you don't want to have happen is the stored values from one run of the one step sticking around in the system and cluttering up future runs of the one step or of different one steps. Let's say you're using multiple stored values, but the one step doesn't always use some of them. So you don't want to set a value to those stored values and then a future run that isn't going to use those stored values accidentally picks up an old value. That's bad. So always make sure that you're cleaning up the values that are used to kind of pass this information between these two one steps, or more. You could potentially have more. The other gotcha is that a given user should only be running any of these one steps that use these store values from a single client at a time. So even if you have multiple Cherwell windows open from the same rich client session, only run this one step in one window at a time. You can run it in one window, and then when that's done, run it in another window. That's fine, but don't run it at the same time, because there is this shared data, this shared stored value, that there is only one copy for a given user. Obviously, there's a copy for each individual user, so if multiple users are running this one step or any one of these one steps on their own machines, they won't clash. That's totally fine. Just be aware that if you try to run two one steps that both use the stored value on the same machine in the same Cherwell session, you might run into issues. In programming, we call this a race condition. Basically, two processes are racing to get to the same point first. And usually no one wins. There are no winners of that race. So just be aware of that and only run one step from this group at a time on a single machine. So that's basically it. That's how to simulate action blocks in versions of CSM prior to 10.1. Stay tuned for our video on action blocks once CSM 10.1 is released. That'll be on this channel. Subscribe to the channel so you'll get notified when that happens. Ring that bell so you'll actually get the notifications, not just see it in your feed. If you like this video, go hit the thumbs up button. We've got some other videos kind of in this same realm. And if you have a specific topic or question that you've been burning to ask, leave a comment below, shoot us an email, and your question could become the topic of a future video. Thanks for watching and have a great week.